Hello. It takes a great many individuals to build the worlds, the stories, the games, and indeed the companies that bring us so much joy in our hobbies. My guest today has actually been at the heart of Games Workshop's evolution more than once. But beyond that, he co-created Dark Future with Richard Halliwell. He has written and edited fighting fantasy books. And he was responsible for helping to build the Black Library and beginning the stories about the Horus Heresy. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Marc Gascoigne. Marc, thank you for joining me. I wanted to start by just looking a little bit about your early gaming life and what got you into the hobby in the first place.
Yeah, I'm obviously known for being at Games Workshop and that sort of stuff. But I got into Games Workshop by doing a fanzine, and I got into doing a gaming fanzine by being a gamer. And we're talking 1976, 77, when the very first glimmerings of RPGs started. I went to a decent middle-ranking boys' grammar school in Ramsgate on the tip of Kent, Isle of Thanet sort of way. And there was already a toy soldier club there using homebrew rules and Mythical Earth, i.e. knockoff Middle Earth figures that Minifix, the venerable historical miniature manufacturers in Southampton, made. And being Lord of the Rings fan of old, I went along and joined in and met a couple of lads there, Mike Lewis, who's a year below, and Ian Marsh, a year above. Ian still remembers me foolishly buying all of his Orc army when he didn't want to play Orcs anymore. Back in the day, Orcs were about that big and cost sixpence, but pre-Citadel days. But we play regularly. We took over the club, frankly, as the older lads moved on, and it became the Sword and Sorcery Society, where we'd sometimes game, we'd sometimes talk about Michael Moorcock and Fritz Leiber and Tolkien and so on, and sometimes, just hang out. And we were keen enough on it that we read magazines like Miniature War Games and Battle for Wargamers, Military Modelling, those sort of things. In Battle for Wargamers, Easter '78. I bought it along with the Buzzcocks album with my pocket money that week. There was an article about this amazing new world called Role-Playing Games, and it had some shots of the upcoming basic rulebook fix-up that Games Workshop were about to publish over here. And so, of course, we said, well, this is exactly what we are looking for. It combines the fantasy stories of the sword and sorcery fiction that we've been reading and enthusing about with the games, and we already got the toy soldiers and things, so this sounds amazing. And in fact, we sat there and drew dungeon maps, no rule system or anything, but we drew dungeons and we moved our figures about, and we thought, well, they could be, they could have 10 hit points and they hit on a 4, 5, 6 and things. We didn't really do much with them. We're still basically playing our own homebrew war game with them. We mail ordered a game, but it was Chivalry and Sorcery. Mike picked that up because they didn't have the D&D rulebook in stock yet for him to buy. So we got that, and we had 4 weeks of having a go at that. Now, I don't know if you know Chivalry and Sorcery, but you can die during character creation and have to start again. It's a specific response to D&D in that they try to make it far more accurate, far more medieval, and a lot of numbers and charts. Eventually, it ended up inspiring the system used in MERP and things like that, but it was so over the top that I think we may have played one dungeon. We may not have played it at all and just done character creation. I certainly know that we kept putting off playing with it again, but every day your character's alive, you get experience points. So we got back together a few months later and had to work out what experience we'd had for not doing anything. So that defeated us. But the moment the D&D basic book, and this is the one with the John Blanche cover, sort of silvery blue cover, was in our hands. That was it, because in the back it was the start of a dungeon. Room 1, 6 goblins. Room 2, a treasure trap with 1 to 3 sturges and all that sort of stuff. And we were off. And the key thing for us really was that you made it yourself. We, in Thanet, where we have Margate, Ramsgate and Broadstairs, we were blessed because Salute, the venerable wargaming show, used to have its summer fair in the Winter Gardens in Margate. So we were suddenly shocked to find there was a massive games convention half a mile down the road. So of course we piled down there, playing all sorts of things. Sorcerer's Cave, which is basically D&D in a modular cave system board game. We played an extraordinary, very pre-Space Hulk shipboarding humans, Space Marines versus aliens game that someone had homebrewed out of some Hinchcliffe miniatures, sort of Martians and things. And we liked that so much that we went home and made our own set and made up what we could remember of their rules. And then we played that every week. And of course, the first glimmerings of D&D. And so on and so forth. Also bought first copies of White Dwarf. I think the first one I bought was issue 11, and then we bought back to the first ones, and first fanzines as well. We picked up a copy of Troll Crusher, an Underworld Oracle, and a Beholder, which were the guys who were first out of the gates D&D fanzines, and they were very much in the traditional mix. Troll Crusher less so because it was written by a whole bunch of people, like an APA, where everyone who gets it contributes, and it's only circulated to those people who contribute. But traditionally they were, here's a little dungeon, here's a equivalent of the Fiend Factory, here's an equivalent of treasure chest with some treasures and so on and so forth. And we thought these are all very good, and we must do our own. So that's what we did. I took a copy of Underworld Oracle to a local printers and said, "Oh, how much for that?" And they, "Yeah, that'll do." This was just as I was finishing up school in 1980, and we typed it out. But how could we be different? Well, we realized as we were writing it that the serious stuff was okay, but we loved taking the piss. And very quickly, and it said on the front of the very first issue, Dragonlords, yet another fantasy and sci-fi roleplay fanzine. So right from day one, there was tongue was in cheek, and that attitude grew and grew. So by the time we got to, issue 4, 5, or 6, doing things like the Corpse, a brand new character class, level 1, a stiff, level 2, a cadaver, level, etc., etc. And what does the Corpse do? Absolutely nothing. It's got a smell attack by level 4, but other than that, you have to carry him around, and completely pointless. We started doing our own comic strips. We still had regular material. I got one here. So what's this, number 5, 6 standard fanzine stuff. 50p, color cover, inside, all just done on typewriter. Ian and I had typewriters with 2 different font sizes on them, so you could tell who's done what. Stupid little comic strip. This is one about a green slime who's very lonely in a dungeon, and then some adventures set him on fire at the end. That was the level of the humor. And obviously, there's regular scenario stuff, all Quest Adventure that we'd played, but then also we do stupid things. So these are our amazing free gift, the cutout dungeon geomorphs. So it's an infinitely modular system for making cave system floor plans to go with your dungeon floor plans, which you just launched. But they didn't do caves. So we thought, if you don't want to do irregular stuff, and all you do is you draw your cave on the back, cut it out, and stick it on your thing. But of course, if you want any more copies for more caves, you have to buy another copy of the fanzine. And yes, it's just a bit of A4 with a stupid joke on the side, but free gift inside and all that sort of stuff. It even says another crazy Dragonlord's free gift inside, etc. So it was plain that our tongue was somewhere in our cheek, and we did 2 things. Firstly, we tapped a nerve, because if all you're doing is copying White Dwarf, only not as good, then you're going to be a subset of a subset. But we were standing out through our probably unbearable middle-class grammar schoolboy humor, and there was plenty of Douglas Adams and Monty Python and all that stuff in there, and an unreasonable obsession with both RuneQuest ducks. We even made miniatures. Actually, damn, I was going to look those out. We made a limited edition Gandrake and Eldrake of Melny Duck and all that sort of stuff. And there's an Indiana Jones one with a duck's head, and it's just RuneQuest full of ducks for no reason. And the other one was Naked Ladies, which again, I think said that although we were kind of inspired by punk, we were still 70s kids, and there were still Python-esque jokes about half-naked ladies and things in there. But the other thing we did was we found a community. We went along to Games Day with our first issue, met a bunch of folks. Next year, we helped organize a fanzine table where people all joined in to sell their stuff and met folks. So a young chap called Paul Mason turned up to help us out of the blue, helped us carry some boxes to the car and all that stuff. And we sent him some money afterwards, so he became our friend for life. He ended up working with us on White Dwarf, and has written the Water Margin RPG and game books and all sorts of things. Still remains a good friend after all these decades. But that organising was really important to us, particularly for Mike. He was very much let's list everyone else's fanzines in the back of our fanzine. And when you start doing that, then you're creating your own community. And it's all of you against the world, or taking the piss out of Games Workshop, who, of course, are big business and therefore the enemy. The Games Workshop thing really kicked in for us when we went to interview Ian Livingstone. A mate of ours said he had a ghetto blaster that you could record onto a tape, because we thought we'd better record this. Yes, it's a big, important interview. So we schlepped up to Sunbeam Road. Neil turned up. The only genuine punk among us. He looked like Sid Snot off the Kenny Everett sort of show, with his studded jacket and stuff. And the silly bugger had forgotten to bring the tape recorder. But nevertheless, we, having been let in by the legendary Albie Fury, and then Ian came in at the time we were expecting him. We were good boys, so we turned up early. We didn't tell him that we'd forgotten the tape recorder, so we sort of made notes as if we were all journalists, and then we went home and made up the whole thing. And put it in the thing, which he got in touch fairly soon afterwards to suggest that maybe some of the things we'd put him down as having said, he didn't entirely have, wouldn't have put it that way. We did lots of silly things. We did a little free board game based on going around Games Day, called the Games Day game, which we even paid out for a little A3 sheet with color printing on it and stuff. Which we learned how to do somewhat last minute on the advice of the printers. We were there late at night colouring in the bits we wanted red or yellow or whatever. And then GW put a version of it in their programme the next year later. We were getting known, really. And Ian says to this day that when first Ian and then myself left uni in 83 and were looking for jobs, that he wanted to hire us to shut us up, or you might as well bring them on side and stop this piss taking and make them legit. I don't know if that's true, but certainly Ian got a job in the warehouse, but then I think Joe Deaver moved on to being a full-time game book writer, since everyone was asking Steve and Ian, can you do these game books for us as well? And of course they couldn't, because they're doing fighting fantasy. So everyone else in the office who had a creative bent said, hey, there's a game book contract going, do you want to pitch? And off you go. So Jamie Thompson, John Sutherland, Joe Deaver and Gary Chalk all got their book deals through some version of that arrangement. So Ian had only been there a little while in the warehouse and immediately was promoted to being assistant editor on White Dwarf, or editorial assistant to then assistant editor. And I went for Ian's job, and I was still sat in reception filling in an application form with my details on, and Ian came in, did a double take, pretended to call security, of course, and then said, once you finish talking to Cess, who runs the warehouse, come and have a chat with me. I think I might have something more interesting. Cess particularly annoyed, of course, because I said, terribly sorry, but Ian's just said, can I go for a slightly better job? And he's like, you've just, not you as well, bloody Ian's only just moved up. He knew, because he knew I knew Ian and stuff. So anyway, went into Ian's somewhat palatial office, very nice, lovely Art Deco drinks cabinet and walnut furniture and stuff. Him and Steve had almost matching long offices parallel to each other on the far side of the offices above the warehouse in Sunbeam Road, sort of Hanger Lane in London, West London. And he gave me probably 24 sheets of paper printed on a very old-fashioned, very specific square font, typewriter font, which I later learnt was the Citadel Miniatures type printer. And this was a skirmish game system that said the Judge Dredd role-playing game system by Rick Priestley. And he says, have a look at that. Tell me what you think. We'd love, I think, to turn this from what's being proposed as a skirmish game into a full RPG. We think there's more in that. Hello, Puss. I knew I was going to meet you at some point. Nice and early. Hello.
Yeah, Mark has decided to get involved now, yeah.
That's fine. You join in. Pick up with them now, anytime you like. And then left me alone. And so I did that and, gave him some notes, wrote a few things down, came back, we read them out. And he says, that's very interesting. Let me have a think. Go away. But ring me up in 3-4 days' time. And I did so. And he pretended to toss a coin on the phone, bugger. And I think that was his revenge, certainly. and then hired me. Now, I have to point out that I was just turned 21. I'd been a part of a team that had made maybe 14, 15 copies of a fanzine and done nothing else in gaming other than play a few games and read some White Dwarfs. And then suddenly it was like, oh, just write the Judge Dredd roleplay game based on this amazing sort of proto Warhammer rule system. But off I went. And what I did was, Ian had connections at 2000 because they got the license, of course. So we went down there. We borrowed every single copy of 2000 AD. I read every single Judge Dredd strip and all the Saturday strips, and spoke to Steve McManus, the then editor, and so on, about what was coming up next. And then just set to work. Slightly hampered by the fact that they bought me what they thought was an amazing word processing system that I could write on, but it turned out to be a data entry port for adding data into a system for someone else to then design from. So it was like a stenographer's kind of input thing, and they paid an awful lot of money for it, a tiny little green screen. So for the first 3 months, I started writing it a pencil on a pad of paper that I'd requisitioned, until eventually Steve Jackson understood that I needed a typewriter at least to note this out. And I'd write all day. And because they had two old school liner type machines, this is all pre-word processing and all pre-desktop publishing, pre-Macintoshes, even that sort of stuff, that they were working on White Dwarf and games all day. So I would write during the day. I tend to write in the morning, edit the previous day's stuff in the afternoon, and then just go and typeset it after work and create these galleys. And slowly but surely, this game built over about 8-9 months. And that was fascinating because I learned all about design. Now, I was one of the, very much interested in design. I was the guy who bought all the letter set rub down transfers for Dragon Lords and that sort of stuff. It was just another hobby to get your teeth into. And actually, when you do a fanzine, of course, you immediately move from being a gamer into being a fanzine editor. Like, I don't know how much gaming you do, but I bet you put all your effort into doing your channel now. And that's as much your hobby as those games you're buying. For one, I suspect you're now tracking down old copies of games, not to play them, but to fuel more things for your channel. And that's how it goes on. As a fanzine editor, you get into the hobby of being a fanzine editor. And what's your hobby? Well, making a fanzine that sells just enough to pay for the next issue. And if not, well, you put a bit more money in, because that's what you do with your hobby anyway, and on you go. And it's very social, and you inspire folks and you mentor folks, and you get surprised, and then you have fights with people and all the usual sort of stuff. It's all good hobby things. But then graphic design turned up. So I was in an office with Ian Marsh, who I'd known since I was 11, and Jamie Thompson, who was called assistant editor, but he was full editor, but Ian didn't want to take his name off the thing. Now, the thing about Jamie, and he's a lovely fellow, and we know him still, and he's had great success with his Dark Lord books for teenagers, where Sauron basically ends up inside the body of a high school boy and tries to take over the world, starting with his own school. They're great fun. But Jamie is the laziest sod on God's earth. So he would just doze all day and make a few decisions, and Ian and I would run rampant. He would say, I need to give Dave Morris a ring, because Dave's doing a RuneQuest scenario for issue 72 or whatever. Can you buzz him through and pass him through? And we'd always give Jamie the number of a sex line. We got him again and again and again. This is a story that didn't make it into Diceman. We got him so many times that in the end he's like, right, I'm not talking to you lot. And so every so often he'd slip out, and we knew what he'd done. He'd gone to reception to say, can you look up the number for Dave Morris, whatever, for the lovely receptionist. And what he didn't know was we'd already got to her, so she was giving him numbers for sex lines as well. So it just went on. And then we got into building seed engines out of office supplies. Now, Ian's a trained engineer, if I remember rightly. Certainly he got a science brain and a love of medieval history. And we had to stop when he created an amazing catapult out of so many industrial strength rubber bands that it shot a steel ruler into the air conditioning unit, showering Jamie with broken bits of plastic and metal. And at that point, we were shut down, and talked about separating us for the good of productivity. But at that point, Jamie was talking about moving on to be full-time writer, and John Sutherland took over. But Tremendous times. Working very closely with the late Albie Fury, who was, I make a point of mentioning him because he's one of the great supporting cast in Dice Men. Not sure how Stephen Ian came to meet him, but he was very much a gaming kind of polymath. It was a crossword compiler. He wrote a really big book on Rubik's Cube solutions for Penguin. But he was also there, laying out the rules for Talisman, or working up in the edition of Railway Rivals, which I think James touched on, the last GW edition. And a really cool guy with an amazing moustache and big hippie trousers and stuff. And he's the guy who's the DM in those old school clips with Ben Elton or whatever, learning D&D from back in the day, 79, 80, 82 sort of times. And it's usually Albie being the GM, because he was like the creative powerhouse in the heart of these things. And he taught me so much about organizing games, about developing games, and about designing them and keeping it clean and what you could get out of. One of these old school Linotronic machines that created strips of text that you then had to glue down with hot wax on a big old blue board. Very much old school. So that was I worked for them 84 through 86 in London. And as we all know, the guys at Citadel in Nottingham were having such a successful time, and Stephen Ian were being pulled more and more into doing fighting fantasy, and they'd had matching Porsches from their second or third royalty statement. Bless them. And it was going well for them. So obviously, they sold up to Brian and crew up in Nottingham, and the offer came to move up with them. And for me, it was good timing. I'd split up with my girlfriend. I was living in frankly, someone had given me the keys and rent book to a hard-to-let council flat that I shouldn't have been in, so I was paying very little rent, but I knew if I went unemployed, I'd have to leave it because I couldn't claim benefit because I was effectively squatting. And so I also, we're in Nottingham, I'm talking to you, still from Nottingham in the Midlands of the UK here. And my folks were from Chesterfield, 10 miles west of here. So it's a bit like coming home, though I grew up down in Kent. So I did move up along with three other folks. Lindsay de Patton became Lindsay Priestley, who's Black Library's chief editor for a long time. A guy called Clive, who was the mail order head, who's a great guy who's still there, and Jervis Johnson. And Jervis had, in fact, been playtesting his Blood Bowl game that he created as we were moving up, and that was one of the first things we worked on. It was like one of the first new productions up here, although it was very much in the sort of bookshelf box shape of the original existing range of Doctor Who and Apocalypse and things like that, Valley of the Four Winds and the Dredd board game, and that kicked in nicely. That was very much. It was really fraught because Brian Ansell, bless him, didn't have a television. Right. He didn't watch telly, so he'd not seen the amazing new Channel 4 coverage. New channel, new amazing sport. Nicky Horn Sunday afternoon presenting the highlights of the American football, which all the rest of us are going, wow, that's exotic, and it looks like it's a bit like chess on legs. So let's get into that. And big fans of American football in the London gaming community, and the same in Nottingham. But Brian didn't get it at all. He kept talking about cancelling it. But everyone else loved it. The miniature designers got behind it and started sculpting miniatures for it, even though they were just going to have card standees in the game. And then, I think it was Ali Morrison who's kickstarted the page of referee symbols, all the funny signs they do, and we all chipped in adding more jokes to that. And then I did all the did you knows, because of course you've got to have sports facts and all that stuff. And suddenly it came alive, and the personality of it came alive. Initially, because it's trying to simulate American football rather than be its own thing, it's a bit clunky. And these days, far more playable as a game in its kind of living rules system. I'm not sure if Jervis has anything. I actually had lunch with Jervis yesterday, not in preparation for this, but just from time to time. I didn't ask him anything about that. I should have done. But I know he's off working on his war games. Well, he pretends to be retired these days, but he's working on historical things and pottering away on clever ideas, no doubt. But you're going to need to ask me some questions now to inspire more thoughts.
Well, I mean,
I've just done you. I think that was what, 3 years of my life, something like that.
sure. I mean, a very sounds like a really incredible period of time and lots of stuff happening during that sort of
Very
short
much so.
window.
No one knew what they were doing, but everyone knew they were on to something. I lasted a year at Citadel GW and then got fired, and I was fired, and part of it was because I wanted them to be better at doing what they were doing. I had very high standards and things, but we were all learning it, so I just made myself quite obnoxious, I'm sure. RPGs were pretty much on their way out. All the stuff I'd been doing. It was fascinating when they hired various folks from TSR UK, Phil Gallagher, Jim Bamburgh, Graham Davis, and Carl Sargent came on board as a freelancer. A bunch of other folks, Paul Coburn and Mike Brunton, came in to run Dwarf and create board games and so on. So they all bedded in. And then most of that team worked on fantasy roleplay as a big powerhouse for about 9 months. And an amazing thing, just the idea of having an RPG that had that level of one grime about it, that proper European, there's a leper somewhere nearby and there's rats beneath our feet. Very different to the American squeaky clean heroes of fantasy, He-Man kind of blonde hair. Those horrible boots that are enormous thigh boots, but they fold them down below the knee. You could never run in. Whereas, anything European, it's got to have lepers in, it's got to have filth, it's got to have rat catchers and, small but vicious dogs and all that sort of stuff. But also for me, it was the fact that the skill tree stuff, while it was demanding, was all incredibly clear. You could know what you wanted to do. And then when you got into the worldview, here's a tavern and here's a floor plan. Oh my God, instant scenario there. Here's a gate post, here's a toll house, here's a mud hut, here's some sewers with floor plans. And just the extra amount of heft that it had. It was a nice chunky book. But the interesting thing was Mike Brunton, who was assistant editor on White Dwarf, and myself, basically we did everything else in the year that the rest of the team were doing that. So we counted up once, it was 5 board games, 12 issues of White Dwarfs, 4 issues of Warlock, the Fighting Fantasy magazine, which we'd taken over and tried to turn into a junior introductory one, and a whole bunch of supplements and mail order leaflets and adverts and flyers and posters and all those things. To the extent that when Wolfrop's first copies came in, Brian turned up with a dustbin full of bottles of champagne to say, hey, celebrate. And Mike and I were like, well, it's nothing to do with us. We've just run the entire bloody company while you standing around. We got over it quickly when people wave champagne under our noses, of course. But back then, of course, it was still role-playing. Warhammer was out, and the second edition was being developed. And this new thing, 40K, was really still a skirmish war game with a GM, and it didn't quite know what it was. Hey, here's something nobody knows. When I left GW, I thought about this for the first time in ages the other day, because you do start thinking about things when people say, come on and talk about things. I had a contract to write the first ever scenario pack for 40K, the Rogue Trader. It was a pack that was going to be called Welcome to Hell. It was basically a growing meat grinder that starts like a simple thing, but as you pull on the threads, the scenarios get worse and worse and worse. And they even paid me money for it. And, I didn't do a stroke other than a really clever pitch document. I'd never written for a war game before or since. And needless to say, after I was let go, although I was still doing a lot of freelance stuff for them, because being fired didn't stop them still wanting to have a Judge Dredd RPG companion, and finish the editing on the second edition Blood Bowl and those sort of things. But that one just quietly went away. I'm sure I've still got the synopsis of it somewhere. I showed you the Blood Bowl script that I still had. I didn't have a copy of that. Pete Nifton had it. Pete and I used to be next door neighbours. It's amazing how things happen. And we were next door neighbours for about 2 years, and then I moved on from GW, and Phil Gallagher came round to see me about the Blood Bowl stuff, and said, we should go out for a beer, and actually let's give Pete a knock. And I'm like, Pete who? And the bloke next door turned out to be Pete, who I'd sort of said hello to in the corridor, but we were all in flats in the city centre, but never really spoke to it. And it turned out he was drawing pictures for the new edition of Blood Bowl. having come from a comics background. And then we became thick as thieves and started planning all sorts of stuff, like not just the Blood Bowl strips, but all sorts of stupid things. And it's funny how just these accidents, like Hal and Rick Priestley meeting in school, and I think sharing a love of Sven Hassel and Mike Moorcock novels or whatever it happened to be, and working together and forming a partnership that allowed them to generate innovative ideas and solid rules and game balance and make things work in these different combinations.
Yeah,
Cool.
it's fascinating. Although it sounds like there was a period of time in Nottingham where every other house must have had somebody who was working at Games Workshop on some of this
Well,
stuff.
that's still the case. I've got a lovely postman here, and he knocks on the door. I'm always ordering books and things, so he stops for a chat because I'm a big book collector. And he's like, "Oh, I was playing that Battle Cars the other day. Did you have anything to do with that?" I said, "No, I don't think so." So, well, how do you know about it? Because you're only in mid-30s. Lovely black guy as well, so not perhaps the constituency to remember Battle Cars. Yeah, the Ian Livingston, frankly, Car Wars knockoff in a box. That then became Dark Future, which perhaps we'll touch on in a bit. He's like, "Oh yeah, no, I was talking to Phil Kelly." Now Phil is Black Library writer, has been head of the studios and various development teams and so on at Workshop for a while. And he says, "Yeah, no, because he was playing something," and I said, "Oh, I've got that," and then he said, "Oh, have you got this?" "No," and I've got this, and so, and that's just the postman around here, and they call it Nottingham the Lead Belt because it's a bit like if you go to Dagenham, there's Fords making Ford Ford Focuses or whatever, but then the Mondeos or whatever, but also there's people who do Ford like spark plugs and tires and seats and paint jobs and so on and so forth, and that spin-off expertise, it's the same in Nottingham for miniatures, so with Warlord and Mantic and the Perrys and many others. It's the people who learned their craft at Workshop are settled, happy, got wife, kids, whatever, or husband, kids. Plenty of creative women involved eventually. We're all still here, which is why, you can go and have lunch with Jervis on a wet Tuesday lunchtime as well, which is all good. And a lot of the gaming groups, are mates who, it's Gav and it's Matt and it's Jake and it's whoever. They come and reform, and then we play some games, and then we don't see them for 2 years, and whatever. We are also of the age now where people are dying. We had Richard Halliwell's funeral last year. We had Brian Ansell's a couple of weeks back, and that we are getting to the stage where we do particularly get together at funerals, and that becomes a bit tedious and depressing. So we're also like, actually, no, let's have a pub meet. Let's get together and play some games like we used to. And every funeral then has a little flurry of follow-up activity. Come for a beer, come out for lunch. Let's actually properly catch up away from the misery. And that's good. And then that's when the real war stories come out, of course. You can't be too scurrilous in a eulogy, though we tried with Halliwell. But it's you have to be respectful. Brian's, I have to say, his niece did a very, very in-depth story of his particular creative journey and his business journey. I don't know her, but I hope she put it on Wikipedia, because it was spot on about all the things that he did to make sure that Citadel worked. Surian was up as well, bless him, and he did a reading. But before that, he talked a little bit about how impressed he was by this young, dynamite-driven, in some cases monomaniacal, but fabulously energetic guy, Brian, who had a vision of what he wanted to do, and it was toy soldiers more than anything. And as we saw the changes reflected in White Dwarf and the product line, his vision pretty much came true. On the other hand, to get there, he also had to basically beat and badger every single person he were to get on board with the vision, because we've all got these amazing ideas all coming at the end. Oh, we've done Blood Bowl. What about Elf Cricket? Yeah, all right, well, work it up. And so spend your lunchtime play testing at Paul Coburn's Elf Cricket game. I don't think it was ever been produced. Or there's a game on some of the lists, and it was mentioned in passing in this eulogy, a game called Frankenstein that Graham Davis and Mike Brunton worked up, where you would go around town, assemble body parts. And we all played that in the office, and that was fascinating because it was a great game, we thought, with Mike and Graham interpreting it. And then they gave a set to Brian Ansell and Alan Merritt, who's was studio head at the time. One of the key figureheads just behind everyone in the great lengthy history, only recently retired. And they took it away and played it at Brian's house, and they couldn't make head nor tail of it. Came back in on Monday morning and cancelled the project. It's like, no!
Right.
If only one of us had been able to get out there and just run you through it and fudge over the bits that were still a bit clunky, we'd have made that one. And that still would make a great game. You're all equals going around town. You have to decide whether you're getting a brain because it's far away or get legs because they're closer or whatever. Yeah, it's like reverse Cluedo almost. But there's so many products like that. Yeah, it's not just cancelled scenarios and things. Dark Future obviously was one of those. Except Dark Future's history is a weird one. Dark Future really is the last vestige of London role playing. I was very much into my cyberpunk. Pete Tamlin was very much into game systems and the philosophy and strategy of game rules and role playing and so on. Come up with a really interesting kind of dice pool system quite a long time before folks, which are called the Rotas system. And I'd read Neuromancer and all around it, but not just think that, but books like Hardwired by Walter John Williams, which is very much an adventure cyberpunk story about hacking corporations and being in the underground. Neuromancer itself is a bit airy-fairy, and it's a proper work of sci-fi literature, whereas Walter John Williams Hardwired, and even Paul Theroux's Ozone, which is just about corporate enclaves and the battles between corporations, they are actually far more gameable. So we wrote this thing up, and everyone was very excited. Jervis came up with the name. I was thinking, it should be the game of Dark Future, and Imazine, Paul Mason's fanzine, did a fanzine article or a special issue devoted to Dark Future. He'd not played it. He'd been in the pub while Pete and I were discussing our intentions. But suddenly we had this thing that was gaining a reputation, and this is purely in RPG circles. As we were moving to Nottingham, pottering away on it, and I did a pitch on it. And it was just full of quotes from William Gibson. The opening of Neuromancer, the sky above the port was like a television tuned to a dead channel, classic line. And I put that at the start, and Halliwell ran over and said, "Oh, this is brilliant. What is this? Is this? And you're going to work on this?" And so a lot of support there. But it was a time when they were getting out of RPGs. Meanwhile, Hal had been asked to revive battle cars. He'd come up with a driving system for a Judge Dredd scenario, Slaughter Margin. If I remember, is it Slaughter Margin? No, it's the other one, Fear and Loathing in Mega City 1. Fear and Loathing in Mega City 1. And it's called that because it's a knockoff of Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is a classic sort of beatnik drug-taking memoir about the journalist Hunter S. Thompson and his lawyer taking drugs and going to Las Vegas for an illegal road race to cover for Rolling Stone magazine. Now, it's exactly the sort of thing that Halliwell, a lifelong enjoyer of all substances, let's put it like that, would read. No one else had read it apart from me. But it's like, oh, this is just a terrible Hunter S. Thompson knockoff. Shush. The judges are going to break up an illegal bike race under Mega City 1. It's going to be great. But he came up with this entire tabletop system for running the race with Lawmaster bikes with your judge characters on, and the good guys and the bad guys and innocent bystanders and things. And we'd seen that and thought, wow, that's almost like battle cars. And people love their cars at GW. Brian Ansell, Andy Jones, Halliwell, various other folks were very much collectors of sports cars, usually clapped out old Jensen Healey's or Lotuses that they bought as much as they could afford, but they were not good quality cars, exception being Brian, I suspect, who could afford more things. But so the idea of a new racing game really took hold. But it didn't have a hook. It was really just, battle cars, the Mad Maxy knockoff game. And Mad Max, having inspired Car Wars and battle cars and half a dozen other similar sort of systems, really was, it's a real tropey node point of that particular imagery. It wasn't quite cyberpunk, it's more post-apocalyptic. So there was a thought that, well, we're not going to do this Dark Future game, but could we build all that around it to give it more of a personality? So without really giving us any money for it. Let's put it like that. All of the background that was in the Dark Future RPG, we had created corporations, Gentech, and all these things, and yeah, we had locations and personalities and areas of activity and cults and things, was suddenly bolted onto the Dark Future battle game. It sort of worked, but the game itself was still just a Mad Maxy Car Wars game. Because you got all this stuff, and then suddenly there's all this color text that says, "Oh, yeah, she works for this or that," and she's sponsored by Gentech, the overwhelming corporate, blah blah blah. But there's nothing very actually cyberpunk about it. There's no hacking, there's no cyberspace, that sort of stuff. So it was a bit of an ill-fitting mismatch, but we kind of made it work, and myself and Graham Davis, plastered it on where we could. We did talk in early meetings about whether it was going to have tiny secret links to Warhammer.
Right.
I really wanted to, because again, we'd done 40k by that point, at least Rogue Trader, and we'd done obviously Warhammer was its second edition, already cleaning up for potential for third, and Blood Bowl. There'd been a lot of discussion whether Blood Bowl was in generic fantasy piss take land with the evil gits and blah blah blah, or whether it was actually Warhammer, and people were coming around to the fact that maybe it is in the Warhammer world. And of course, Griff Oberwald of the Nuln whatever, or the Reichland Reavers, myself, Pete Nifton, and others coming up with those sort of terms. Plainly, we were putting it in Warhammer, whether people wanted it to be in it or not. And he was like, well, it's sort of Warhammer, but it's not today's Warhammer. It's an alternative. Again, that continuity, which I know you talked to Chris Pramus about when they were trying to create an RPG that was set not in a time where Warhammer has just burnt itself down, similar sort of decisions that they have to make today, post Age of Sigmar on the Return to the Old World and all that stuff. It's an ever-present continuity issue, whether you hold it in place or you keep it moving. And if you keep it moving, then if you're doing spin-off RPGs or spin-off board games, you have to decide where they're set. And this is ongoing. The same thing at Aconite with the Arkham Horror. Do we follow the exact continuity of the card game, which every time they do a new pack, the story moves on, or is it set in a sandbox? Same with Legend of the Five Rings, same with Call of Cthulhu, same with so many other settings. As an aside, I worked on Faz's game Earthdawn, which was the fantasy Shadowrun inspired game, was Byzantine, and that was written from day one as a 10-year cycle of apocalypse. So it was going to be a finite product line, and that would be it. Still amazing stuff to do with it, and then things would happen, basically an end of the world type event. So seeing it from the other way, that was very controlled, but it was also quite self-contained and all run through the one too. But anyway, we plastered this stuff in. We decided that there would be one reference in one bit of color text to a cult somewhere out in the desert that was doing something. And I think it refers to a symbol that, if you think about it, it's a corn symbol.
Right.
But that was it. Now, this is as I left GW. A year or two later, obviously, they're starting up their first fiction line. And they thought, who are the best people to do sci-fi in the UK? They went to Dave Pringle, who runs Interzone. Now, Brian particularly, huge fan of Michael Moorcock and the new wave of writers, always very impressed by sci-fi writers. And Dave Pringle at Interzone was the cutting edge still of the new wave of SF, even though very much bedded in by that point. But David could get the word out to anyone who wanted some money and who was prepared to put some effort into it, that this was this stuff inspired by Moorcock and craziness, but it still had to have some rules. Now, of course, the whole history of the GW book line, I wasn't there, but it worked for a while. There were people who really got it. Ian Watson, for example, sort of got it. Barrington Bailey too. But really what they did was, because their writing had inspired some of the elements of 40k, they just pushed on what was already there. And then some of the stuff that people like Ian did was also beyond the pale, hinting at homoeroticness amongst the Space Marines and so on. Ian's a bit of a dirty bugger, bless him. I love him dearly. And having worked with him, reviving the Inquisitor novels, became close and so on. And he's still around. He's still producing books and stuff. And he's always been very interested in human extremes and so on, which is one of the things that the new wave of SF, particularly in the UK scene, with Ballard and Moorcock and Slardek and various others, were pushing on those sort of things. Is it Warhammer? Not in the slightest. But some of the imagery was certainly stuff that they could put on. There were other writers who didn't get it at all. They didn't phone it in, but they were able to find an area where they could write the book they wanted to write. That was then sort of a bit like a distant area of Warhammer Fantasy role plays. Yeah, the Zaragoza stuff and so on and so forth. It's interesting, but it's not core to the experience. And then, of course, there are also brand new writers. Bill King had been working on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and doing a lot of the color text and so on. So he was kind of like in-house fiction guy. Is everyone aware that it's Gotrek and Felix on the cover of Wolfram?
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
I think that's sort of.
It's like for a lot of us, we've got. Of course, it is. For God's sake, stripy trousers and the biggest dwarf you ever met with no knees. So yeah, people like Gotrek and Felix were always there. So Bill, just keep writing your Gotrek and Felix stories. So yeah, there was always one of those. But there were other people. Yeah, there was a Tanith Lee story. There's a John Brunner Gotrek and Felix story, which we found in the vault that had never been published when we reopened them when I was doing the second wave of DW publishing with the Black Library itself in its early days, where we're desperately looking to see what we could revive because Dan Abnett and Bill King couldn't write fast enough to fill up the schedule. And we were having to train folks. But that was the big thing, really. Getting folks to write Warhammer stuff without it being managed by someone who understood Warhammer. Because Dave Pringle's an incredibly bright guy and very influential in the British scene. But he wasn't in the business of creating tie-in fiction. He was in the business of creating amazing stories using some incredible talents who wouldn't be told what to do. With guidelines that, they tried to follow and the guys in Nottingham tried to enforce, but it wasn't the best meeting of minds. The most successful was Kim, definitely with Drachenfels and so on. But even a lot of that, he was synthesizing the hell out of Frankenstein, and there's allusions to Cold Comfort Farm and Edgar Allan Poe and all sorts of things in it. And why not? A very bright guy, but he, to this day, he's a guy who synthesizes fiction and and fact and history together into the Anna Dracula books. Where it's Dracula marrying Queen Victoria and all this sort of amazing things going on. He gets that postmodern mashup kind of thing and did way back. And of course, then when he came to pick up Dark Future, which is really where I started talking about this, he picked up that hint that there was madness going on and ran with it. So suddenly Elvis is suddenly involved, and mashup versions of an alternate history pop culture are involved. And we didn't have much to do with that in my time. And I think in terms of Dark Future, he could pretty much do whatever he wanted with it as long as it was interesting and intriguing. What he wanted to do was write intriguing mashup what if stuff that alluded to other bits of pop culture and go large with it. Even in his stuff, there is not much of the hint of a Warhammer mythos. There's a couple of tiny references that come out of that, but he was much more interested in the kind of postmodern mashup rock and roll stuff. And it became the case, I think, that the novels were a lot more interesting than the board game, frankly. They gave it a certain reputation, just as Drachenfels and things had great reputations as being inspired by, but taking the Wolfram setting further out into interesting ideas that then, they then worked up into a big scenario pack with the vampires and so on and so forth. But the vision for it wasn't as shared. Not everyone was working off the same hymn sheet, and there weren't people in-house who were able to say, no, famous author, that's crap, mate, or it's great writing, but it's got nothing to do with us. These days, and actually even when we started Black Library proper, which wasn't till 97 or so, we realized that we had to be the people who said how it was going to be. And I think Dan Abnett, obviously the biggest, brightest shining star to come out of BL, but only one of several star writers to come out of BL. Their early work, the second Gaunt's Ghost story, Andy Jones rewrote it line by line and reassembled it and then sent it back to him and said, this is how it's going to be. The third one, I think we can't do this one because you don't get it, mate. It took an awful long time of day by day taking things apart and saying, It's lovely, Dan, but it ain't how it should be. It's got to be like this. And there were times when he's like, oh, but I think it's such an amazing image. We've got to keep it in. There was a particular thing. One of the Gaunt's books starts with a fairly certain it's a Gaunt book because it's 40k one, about a wasp waste starship. In other words, he wanted a starship that looked a bit like a flying wasp, like a Chris Foss kind of mutant thing. That's great, but nothing in 40k has a pinched waist. They're cathedrals in space. That's what 40k, that's Fleet Gothic stuff. And none of the alien stuff is like that. And we went to and fro, but it's such a cool image. Yeah, but it's got nothing to do with us, mate. It's like, yeah, if you're writing Batman and suddenly he's giving it all up and he's running a sweet shop, unless there's a big reveal, don't do that. Learning what our strengths were and learning how to collaborate non-destructively with people was one of the big learnings, and probably one of the biggest observations looking at the way that the David Pringle stuff worked, where it ended up being too much of a clash of personalities. And can you free up the talent to write it? Well, that's hard with tie-in fiction because it's got to be part of the continuity. We know what a Space Marine is. You can't change it without changing the whole game. Now, there are ways and means that you can influence things, deliberately or not. In some cases, just down to need. We didn't know what radios on the battlefield were called, so Dan called them Voxcasters, something a bit Latinate. Great. Within 3 months, GW's official Twitter handle is Voxcaster and all that stuff. Where there's a data slates, iPads, that's all they are, but data slate because it's it's old-fashioned. Things where there weren't terms for, Dan had to create, but he was right there. He wasn't the only one. Other people were doing similar, but he very much the epitome of that. And that's where you get the great kind of feedback loop where the game inspires creativity that then goes back into the game almost immediately. The biggest example, of course, is Horus Heresy. Andy hired me for BL, well, not for BL, to typeset a Warhammer Quest scenario pack. Andy Jones is absolute powerhouse of new ideas. And he'd got him to, he's like Jervis, actually, he'd started as a salesman, but his creativity slowly but surely moved into a place of doing more interesting projects. In Jervis's case, in his spare time, he came up with the fantasy Blood Bowl. In Andy's case, he started running all the different things that were not studio-based. And feels like an idea. Yeah, well, do it myself. Warhammer Quest was one of those. He wanted that early days of D&D experience, but with a Warhammer twist. Warhammer Quest, it's such a specific thing. It's like the first 5 games of any RPG you play, where there's a dragon in one room and 4,000 goblins in the next, and they're not eating each other. It's just crazy fun, drunken madness in a box with all the bits. It's great fun, that kind of when you imprint it on RPGs. It's like the first heavy metal album you ever heard. It'll always be one of your favorites.
Yeah. Maybe
it's a guilty pleasure, maybe it's not, but that fun of that innocence and the shocks and surprises of playing your first RPG, whether it's on a board or just dice and paper, it does such a great job of that, and very humorous. And we even had some of his fantasy stories from his own games, where one of the characters is the character Gav Thorpe played, and a couple of the studio guys and so on. It's that parochial in the early issues of Inferno. But he got himself to a place where he had lots of ideas, but there was no studio time, no capacity for him. A bit like what I was saying, I had to stay late to typeset Judge Dredd because there was no one else to do it. So you just do it, or it doesn't happen. But driven folks just get on and find a way. And he spoke to Jerv, and Jerv was like, "What have you said? What about asking Marco? Because he's been off doing Shadowrun and Cthulhu and all sorts of things, and also a lot of different things in the children's books area and all that sort of stuff. Fighting fantasy, we did for a long time. But he's also a designer because he knows that, he typeset the original Dread and came up here to train the people how to do White Dwarf when we moved up and all those things. So I ended up just doing some freelance. So we did, the Bretonian Knight. We did some Warhammer scenario pack, Grudge of Drong, Idol of Gork. I typeset those. That's it. Okay, fair enough. And then he's like, Rick and I have been talking about doing a sort of Warhammer Blue Peter annual. I got it immediately because Blue Peter annuals, while they're not hardly cutting edge of publishing, but that idea of photo stories and cutaway diagrams and comic strips and fiction and non-fiction and background, you could apply that to Warhammer as a hobby. here's amazingly painted miniatures and how to do them. Here's a look at the new range of this. Here's a history of this. Here's a cutaway through a Land Raider. Here's what's inside a Space Marine's helmet. And here's a comic strip about 3 funny orcs. Yeah, you could do that. So the GW annual, it became something else as it developed and became Inferno. They didn't want fairly rapidly to put any important game material in it because that's what White Dwarf was for. Why would you cannibalize it? And that's happened a few times. So back in the first wave, I was doing little scenarios for some of our licensed games. Golden Heroes, Call of Cthulhu, and we call them monthly modules. So Trail of the Loathsome Slime, one of the best named Cthulhu adventures ever. They were little, 24, 48 page adventures out for a few quid. And the issue we got to there was White Dwarf paid a better page rate than a published scenario would do, and there weren't enough authors there wasn't such an embarrassment of riches that we had scenarios just sitting there in a pile saying, publish me somehow. Everyone was crawling for Marcus Rowland's time or whoever's done, but it was mostly Marcus. So in the end, we had to cannibalize that. And that was the same with the early Inferno. So we ended up with this thing that was, we can do cutaways, we can do comic strips, and we can do stories. And then it's like, well, if it's going to be a pulpy magazine, perhaps it should be like a Weird Tales type thing, which is why I ended up in that slightly weird A5-y size. And it was sort of half done when I was hired. And it was like, right, you want to come in and work on this? And we were deliberately positioned not in the design studio, because there was the creative studio, which is right in the centre of Nottingham. And then there was the metal casting plant at Eastwood, far more industrial, ex-mining village sort of town. And we were there, and we had one desk between us. This is April 2000, April 19, when was it? April 97. That's when Black Library started, April 4th, 97. Yeah. And that's right. Yes, I mixed up earlier when I said 2000, because that's when Angry Robot started, because I did 11 years of Black Library that time around. We had one desk between us, a chair either side. And luckily I'd bought a pad and a pencil from home, remembering my Judge Dredd days. And we wrote out a whole bunch of ideas, and we had Gotrek and Felix, and Bill said he'd write some stories. Dan wanted to work on this sort of dark elf strip, but he didn't have a name, this sort of Elricky dark elf. And we wrote a bunch of prefixes and suffixes, so like dark, black, blade, sword, whatever. And we rolled a dice pretty much. They're all dark blade. Oh, that's cool. Oh, so, and then what's his first name? Or something that means dark, or Malefic. Well, we've got various Mals, but Malus. Oh, Malus Darkblade. Well, if he's Malice, then his horse or his lizard is Spite, because you've got Malice and Spite. There we go. I gave that to Dan, and off he went. And long running, brilliant. He's a dark elf, but he's not a good dark elf, but he's out for himself, not the ultimate enslavement of all mankind, the way that dark elves are. Dark elves are only like that because Jervis wrote the Dark Elves, and the evil gits in Blood Bowl. They're so evil. They're the most evilest things in all of Evil Land. That's just because of the way Jervis wrote Dark Elves in Warhammer. It's like, they're so evil. They live in the dark and they're evil. Yeah, but how are they more evil than evil? Oh, they just eat the evilest things in Evil Day. It's like, yeah, all right. But Malice managed to do that, and Dan had various ideas for a bomber squadron, and he wanted to do like a 633 squadron thing, but as Titan pilots that became the Titan comic strip, and so on and so forth. Various ideas for bits and bobs, and just random bits that had been in a drawer that people had worked on. And we just worked it up. Kev Walker did a cover with Khan the Betrayer that was the wrong dimensions to go on the dimensions we picked, and I squished it up and sent it to Kev, who gave me an absolute bollocking down the telephone. So don't squash up the artwork. It was also, bizarrely, because we were getting our own artwork, we had to have a scanner to scan it, because in those days, original art. So, when big ones you'd photograph, but back in the day, there wasn't really high quality digital cameras and so on and so forth. So you'd still end up scanning. So I bought a scanner, and it came with Photoshop. Now, Photoshop was banned in Games Workshop because people were supposed to follow the guidelines. Humans were Helvetica, Dark Elves were this. That's no change in the design. It was like the 40K experience itself. The Emperor says you must only use Times New Roman for all your rules text and so on and so forth, which is great. But there's this bugger up in Eastwood with Photoshop, who's doing amazing things. So on day one, I made a 3D concrete 40K double-headed eagle that rotated. And that was it. And suddenly the floodgates were open. And Inferno was a place where you could push on, different ideas of design, different layout ideas and so on. And then next thing you know, more time's coming, and John Blanche has chosen the fonts, and he's gone off piste for the fonts. He wants proper medieval fonts and things. And because I'm a font boy, they'd always buy fonts that didn't have bloody Euro symbols in, but they wanted to put them in the box. Marco, could you just make us a Euro? Yes, I can. My fee was always a bottle of wine, which was great. Fanatic guys a little bit later. We've designed a Fanatic font that Steph Kapinski's drawn. It's great. Yeah, but he's drawn it, but it's not in the computer. I know you're good with fonts. Do you think you could? Yes, that'll be 2 bottles of wine, that one. And so the Tau then had their own font. The Inquisitor had its own font, and so on and so forth. And could you just make the F a little longer? And all this. That I loved all that stuff. Yeah, as I say, get into the design as much as everything else. Which then came in handy when we were starting to do art books, and the Liber Chaoticas and the Guide to the Tariff Campaigns and Imperial Infamous handbook, the little one, where all the fonts were hand designed for that to be slightly wrong, and because they printed it for 480 years, and the fonts are degraded and wobbly, and they're still using the same old typeset for whatever XXXX edition of this classic book. Going that extra mile to make it authentic seeps in, and actually that fanaticism has always been a part of what GW do. They can't help themselves but go crazy, and you can always tell when the really good stuff is. You think, oh my God, look at the detail on that. Oh, Andy's added a squig hanging off his back pocket, and there's that, and there's that. And I'm in no way a miniatures guy. I'm a role player. I'm a board gamer. Card games particularly I like, but I love getting inside a world and making it work, even if it's as flung together as Fighting Fantasy certainly was, and frankly, as 40K and Warhammer have their original bits, but also bits that are plainly inspired by elsewhere. But I particularly love those miniatures where you look at it and think, how have you even cast this? It's a dragon on one tip of one wing with 3 people hanging off it, and it's upside down, and there's a giant, or whatever. Trish Morrison, as was particularly her dragons. Even in my first time working in the studio, I'd hang out with them over a coffee first thing in the morning, just look in wonder at the wire work inside these things. Going, what are you trying to do? Oh, I see. So he's hanging off that while doing that. And for me, they're the things. The Golden Demon Award winners. Bloody hell! Look at the artistry on that. Transcends being a game or toy soldiers, and it's proper artwork with real artistry. And no wonder these guys have had such success. The best miniature designers in the world making the most extraordinary things. I don't know if you're aware when they were doing Lord of the Rings, that Peter Jackson invited himself to Lenton, and the big headquarters still there now, because he started as a puppeteer and model maker. That's where Weta grew out of, making things like Brain Damage and so on. All the aliens are all puppets that his team made, and that's how they got into making horror movies, and then grew into proper fantasy making. And he came and sat with the guys and molded stuff with green, carved stuff with green stuff, and had it all cast up and stuff. He really got into it, which is also then how folks like Alessio and the Perrys were then had a return invitation to come and star in the third film, as extras, but still, in it, did that sharing of passions and doing something beyond what's needed, not just the will this do, but can't stop yourself passion. That's the amazing stuff, isn't it? And eventually Black Library got to that. But what I was saying, 4 hours ago, Horus Heresy, that very first day over that table, one of the things we put on the list, I asked the question, well, is Horus Heresy available to us or not? I said, don't go there. It was a sideline. Yeah, but it's grown. It's a legend. It's unstoppable now. But it only took 9 years to get to the point where we commissioned Horus Rising. And obviously they're now finishing up the last of the last books. And time has moved on, and the people on the records are very different names to what they were like. I do take some pleasure in sitting back and going, I helped get that going finally and set it on its path. And it was simple things like, the Horus Heresy has its logo and things, and that's, we deliberately wanted book covers that looked like history books, like Faber Classic history books, with the panel and the gold and so on. And finding an artist like Neil Roberts, who's done, I think, all but one of the covers, is now the one he didn't do because he wasn't available. He's now gone back and redone it for the special edition. So there's a complete Neil. I think they've got the book coming of the collected Neil Roberts covers. He was the only person we could say to 10,000 Space Marines surround a medieval style city, like it's something from 1530 in Italy with Landsknechts and pikes and millions of folks, because he was very much cutting edge digital stuff where he could clone things and then just rework the shadows on the helmets to make every single one of them individual. He was also a nutter, obsessive, who couldn't stop himself doing amazing work, of course. And local to the Midlands as well, as it happens. So a perfect storm of talent there again. And that's, they've kept him busy, haven't they?
Yeah.
Same for Dan and for Graham and Aaron.
Certainly have, yeah.
Various other folks.
But it doesn't sound like, I mean, like where Black Library has ended up now, it like there was almost, was there any conception of that at the outset when you and Andy were sat at that same table?
It wasn't really. We were quite good at retrofitting our strategy. Oh yes, Inferno, it's a test bed. And if we can do stories and comic books, then we'll start a comic and then we'll move on to a best-selling fiction line. Yeah, that was our plan. It wasn't. It was try stuff, see what happens. Yeah, it was get one out, ridiculously with newsstand distribution. And boy, did a lot of those come back. It was, quite pricey because it was, it wasn't normal sized and so on. I mean, God knows what it was. We tried it for a while. But it did become pretty clear a few months into the life of First and Only, which is the first Gaunt novel, that and Into the Maelstrom, the collected Inferno short stories, which is a fairly easy fix-up, I think named after Chris Pramus's first 40K story from Inferno, that we had to keep reprinting both of them. And First and Only obviously kept going. It's extraordinary planning to have the first book Black Library ever did called First and Only, but there you go. But those did hit pretty much immediately. Other stuff, not so much. The fortunes of the different lines within it tied to the fortunes in the game. For a while, we got away with doing sort of Warhammer stories, but they were things like Gilead and so on. They're interesting stories, but they're really role play stories. The Clint Werner witch hunter ones and so on and so on. They're not part of the mass battles where Bretonians scouring across the mountains at the dwarves and the Empire and so on. And that's partially because it's a stasis. Yeah, there's excuses for grudge battles, but there's no history happening. There is no Age of Sigmar in old school Warhammer at the time. We eventually ran out of steam on that, and there was discussion about discontinuing Warhammer Fantasy novels for a while, about 4 or 5 years in.
Right.
But there was enough, and there was stuff coming. More time was coming. Computer games were coming. So it was a case of hanging on for the better times to come. More importantly, was actually the credibility of BL within GW. We were not set up to sell any books within shops. In fact, we were banned from the shops because the shops sell toy soldiers and their supports.
Right.
You do a licensed thing, you go to the licensee and they sell in their territory. So the very earliest computer games, never for sale in a GW store. You go into Game or, whatever, your video game outlets to buy your video games. Comics, you get in a comic shop. Books, you should get in a bookshop. And we pursued that. It's when we found that Games Workshop UK as Salesforce, who were based the other side of reception in London to the Black Library office, had told people, oh no, we're not official, we're not part of Games Workshop, those Black Library guys, we're not sure who they are really, but we better put a stop to them. That we had to really discuss what the strategy was going to be going forward. And quite frankly, we love bombed them. They weren't used to getting free stuff. A big new 40K rule set, everyone within the company would get a copy with a nice bookplate, but you see a new miniatures box, you have to go and buy it at staff discount, which is all fine, but there's so much stuff you can't have it all. But we would deliberately go around, new Gaunt's Ghost novel, anyone? Gimme. We then found out that some of the guys in the sales team, their bonuses went down if they shifted Black Library stuff to stores, because they should be selling more toy soldiers, of course. So that one needed sorting out. We weren't in White Dwarf, except for, I think we had a preview issue of Inferno and then nothing for quite a while. But working with them to put an advert in and then excerpts, and then 3 novels in. And just by not going away and not curling up and dying, eventually, what you do is you end up at a place where the new talented people in the sales team or the studio have grown up with Black Library. So of course Gaunt's Ghosts are official. Of course Gotrek and Felix are part of the continuity. And if you're doing something set at that time, they're the people you reach for, not somebody different. And it takes time. And it's the same techniques we've used at Aconite. You start off working alongside the continuity, but eventually you start using famous characters, or your characters go back into the game, which is what's happening next month with their big Arkham character. Contessa Alessandra, who's started in a novel by Josh Reynolds, ex-BL writer, 3 years ago, and is now in the new card game, with more to come. And then it really starts to feed back in. So suddenly, Horus Heresy is an extreme example. We will never make a Horus Heresy game, Alan Merritt told me. Yeah, but eventually Forge World were tempted just to do a few variants and a few conversions, and then an entire game. Good luck to them for that. And if they'd never made it, then Horus Heresy would still have been a success, because it's a fascinating period, all that prehistory stuff. Not to say it was planned out. That one definitely wasn't. We did say that maybe there'd be 12 Horus Heresy books. There'd be 3 to start. We knew that one. That would be Dan, Graham, I think Ben was the third one. And then we'd have something, because none of the history of the heresy had been written down. We knew there were a few points, but goodness knows. And then we'd have 3 to finish, possibly Ben, Graham, Dan, because that'd be cute. I don't know what it is, 74, 69 books, plus all the Primarchs novels and spin-offs and novellas and miniseries, plus all the rules and the battle reports, and obviously the big Forge World kits and so on and so forth. But the other thing they did was, because folks like Alan and Rick didn't know what the history was, right, well, let's get Dan and Jim Swallow and Graham McNeil and everybody else round a table, and we'll work it out between us, because these guys are now trusted. And if they're involved, then they'll come up with great ideas, but they'll also hear the warnings of stuff not to do. So it wasn't imposed on them the way it was in the early days. It was a collaborative thing. And because it was Horus Heresy, right, when we're working on certainly the second stage of it for books 4 onwards, there still wasn't any thought of games, so it was never going to be a problem. And yes, all right, I had complete history of the Horus Heresy written on my special books project list, but it was under the revival of the Liber Chaotica, Bound Up in Chains and all that sort of stuff. But it was increasingly, those sort of things became possibilities. So we'd stick them on the development list, but not activate them until ready. And at that point, it was the case that I think we would allow ourselves to say that, things were starting to take shape and opportunities were being recognized. And if they turned up, then we'd take them. Not everything that was on the list was ever actioned, particularly on the special projects, but plenty of them were made and continue to be made, which is cool. I'm disappointed that perhaps the way they're now doing it, they're very much in support of the game product. And it's a long, long time after, I left in 2008. I went off to do my own Angry Robot line, pure creator-owned sci-fi and things. At that point, it became secondary to supporting game releases. And that means that the finding a way to make it work, coming up with some misfires, but also inventing new things that people hadn't thought about, that impetus has broadly gone away. And they're still making incredibly high quality stuff. And some of the novels are at least as good as anything that have ever been done. And people remain huge fans of them. And the move into audio dramas, I think, has been amazing, because then you get the full effect, and it's something you can do while you're painting your minis, which is very much hand in hand strategically with what the hobby is about, certainly. So that's really clever, and doing them themselves is a great advance as well, I think. But it's a shame that they're not looking for the crazy innovative ideas. But that's personally, that's my thing. That's what gets me excited. When you've done even 9 Horus Heresy novels, or 7 Gaunt novels, and there's another. Well, I think we plotted 15. Dan and I between us, but that was a long time ago, and I'm sure that's changed. But they're okay. But that's the everyday stuff. But the Friday afternoon stuff, right? What are we going to do with this art book line? what can we do that's a funny little artifact for the Warhammer world? Oh, how about the Life of Sigmar and bind it up like a Bible? Oh yeah, that's mad. Do that for Games Day. They do some of that, but what I don't see is the bit that makes you look twice. Wow, that's interesting. High quality, yes. Beautiful books, special limited editions. That's part of their business now, and why not? If fans want it, then make it as luxurious, and that plays up to 40k in the arcaneness. Make it look like an artifact.
Yeah,
but I'm not seeing too much madness coming out of it. But out of the miniature designers, there's still madness and whims and wonder. I think Black Library could do with more madness.
Well, stuff like those sort of in-universe artifacts, like Life of Sigmar. Some of that is, for me at least, the most exciting and interesting stuff, because it's so. There's only one place you can get that. That exists within the world of Warhammer, and you're getting a glimpse into it, and sort of it's
the primer was the one for me. The book that every soldier in the 40k universe had in his back pocket and read as catechisms. And we would hear about gamers reading a prayer from it at the start of the of a game and so on. Those sort of things. We did also. I've talked several times about falling in love with graphic design and font design and so on. Making the limited editions of those, particularly, the 4 Chaos God books, with the metal slipcase, and then the Nurgle one with a plastic slipcase filled with slime in a lockbox, and all those sort of things. The only thing I was never able to source, a print buyer called Carol Sanderson, who's now retired, but she would love saying, "Oh, I've got a really wild one for you. Can we have a slipcase made of aluminium that slides out and there's a hole in it, but when you pull it out, it forms a map?" And that was the Life of Sigmar book, I think, which we did.
I've never seen that.
And the one we unfortunately it's buried in the corner here in the box, but definitely a Warhammer Fantasy one. It had a map of the old world, and half of it was on the out of the slipcase, and the other half was on the metal cover of the book. So when you pulled it out, it was one thing.
That's great.
But the only one we could never do, I wanted a concrete slipcase. So it was a sliver of concrete with a gap in it that a book went into. And we're going to do a dwarf book, of course. It's got to come in a slipcase. And we were never found it. I have now seen somebody else in the last couple of years did a Japanese book in a like a molded semi-plastic concrete amalgam with a book inside. We won several print awards for these things. We were obviously a bit off the radar, but in the print circles, we were never going to stand up next to Cartier or Gucci's amazing book with a leather cover or whatever. But within the print industry, Liber Chaotica, the one with you see the collected Liber Chaotica, which is it's all 4 of the Liber Chaotica books in a big hardback, but embedded in perspex that's bolted together. With the chaos covering the cover, and then wrapped in 4 feet of chain because it doesn't want the contents to escape. That we won an award for that one. People just like, "That's a book. What are you doing?" Well, anything we like, as long as it's in keeping and gets people excited. And obviously, the tradition of medieval chained manuscripts, where the great books in Winchester Cathedral are chained to the desks because they're too precious. In this case, it was wrapped up because whatever's inside it can't be let out to prying eyes, and so. Those we used to, as I said, we used to call them the Friday afternoon projects, and Carol rubbed her hands together with Lee. But it also took us to meet fascinating people. Like we talked about doing books with lenticular covers, those sort of fake hologrammy things that when you get kids' rulers that do them, like dinosaurs that wiggle about. Lead centre for the lead centre in the world for those, Belper, Derbyshire, 8 miles from here. Right. So we had a great day talking to them and about holograms and lenticular and so on. Far too expensive for us to do, unless you're doing 200,000 copies on the front of a Harry Potter book or whatever. You're not going to be able to do that. But we never quite got there with those. But all that sort of stuff. Andy Jones, always obsessed with old school rub down action transfers. I don't know if you've ever seen these. It's like you had a folder, it was like the D-Day landings and a sheet of letter set, but it wasn't letters, it was landing craft and explosions and Spitfires and Germans and tank traps and emplacements and things, and you'd rub them in and create your own action scenes. Would love to have done some of those. We costed those up and they're too expensive, but we'd have loved Inferno to come with it. Oh, comes complete with rub down action transfers, creating a 40k battle scene one day. But that's also why I don't know if you've spoken to Andy, but at some point you certainly should, because obviously, let's have a record label, let's do books, let's do comics, all these different things. When the money's flowing, particularly, and you're just looking for ideas, you'll try anything. So in the end, Black Library ended up also creating Solaris, our original line, and Black Flame, for other tie-in stuff that Games Workshop come over, and eventually revived some of the tabletop games with Black Industries, because there was plenty of money and it was a way to push growth and experiment. And if it worked, it would bed in and become a new area. As it happened, after I moved on and various other folks moved on, it was no, stick to your knitting, back to what we're good at. And I think post Lord of the Rings, and the expectations of being a public company, when there aren't Lord of the Rings movies to fuel even more sales of a game based in those movies, of course, share prices can go down as well as up. And go back to what you do best. Makes perfect sense. It was a shame, but for a while, Solaris came out, won awards. Just won a monthly one, Best British Comic, but only because 2000 AD had been disqualified after 20 years, winning it every year. He retired it. But they're all opportunities to try things, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I'm out there, Solaris is still going, Dark Heresy, and obviously its follow-up RPGs still doing stuff. Talisman will always be one of the great intro games. It's just Monopoly for fantasy fans with a terrible end game, just like Monopoly, but slowly but surely it gets better and better. Eventually it'll work, but maybe the computer game version is better because you can whiz round it, and then it's always your turn, which is perhaps the way, as same with Monopoly, frankly. But people have such great formative memories about these things. Again, imprinting. If the first fantasy game you ever played was basic D&D, you'll always have a soft spot. Same with fighting fantasy game books. Same with Talisman, and same with Warhammer. If that's your thing, why move on?
Absolutely, yeah, and yeah. I mean, all of that is fascinating. Sort of tales.
I told you you'd only get 2 sentences in.
Well, I'm conscious we have run out of time, so there's plenty more questions I'd love to talk to you about one day. Perhaps we'll get back together and talk fighting fantasy and some of that stuff as well. But I really do appreciate you.
Yeah, we didn't talk fighting fantasy at all, did we?
Next time. We'll get into it next time. But no, Mark, that was absolutely awesome just to hear those stories. So thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time to talk to me. It was a real pleasure hearing just some of the stories from your incredible career at Games Workshop and beyond. There are so many more questions I would have loved to ask. I really hope that we get the chance to talk again in the future. If you enjoyed my conversation with Marc Gascoigne and the work that I do here on the channel, please feel free to check out my Patreon, my Ko-fi, and to join my Discord. All of the links are in the description below, and you will also find my Element Games affiliate links, so when you buy your hobby supplies, you can support the channel as well. Thank you once again to Mark for joining me. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.